President Cyril Ramaphosa has signed the Electoral Matters Amendment Bill into law today. It eliminates the existing caps on donations, and it also alters the criteria used by political parties in declaring donations. Now, the president also has the power to determine limits with the guidance of the National Assembly. Let's speak now about this. And joining us for the conversation is IFP Chief Whip Narend Singh, Democratic Alliance Member of Parliament Adrian Roos, and the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, or CASAC for short. And the gentleman representing that organization is Lawson Naidoo. To all of you, gentlemen, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Can I start with you? Let me start with you, Mr. Roos. When we talk about this bill that has been signed by the president, eliminating existing caps on the donations, what does that mean exactly for a viewer who's interacting with this information for the first time? What does this mean for donations towards political parties?
Well, look, this bill is a money grab. And what is happening here, if we talk about the elimination of limits, is basically at the moment the Political Party Funding Act, it limits the amount of money that you can get from one funder to a maximum of 15 million rand. And then there's also a threshold. So any donations over 100,000 rand, or a combination of donations over 100,000 rand, then has to be declared. So anything below that doesn't have to be declared.
Let's come to you, Mr. Singh. I'm going to come to Lawson Naidoo in a moment, who's going to try and sum it up for us. When you hear Mr. Roos talking about this bill as a money grab, what does that tell us in simple language?
Well, thank you very much, colleague, to you and to your viewers. And firstly, on behalf of the IFP leadership, our heartfelt condolences to those families that have lost loved ones in this tragic circumstances in George. And we pray for the successful recovery of all others that are still under the rubble. Yeah, I agree with my colleague. It is a money grab because I think, Tony, we've spoken before, and as my colleagues on the panel would know, the question of the amendment to the formula which regulates funding to political parties is something that we've objected to, because we did not believe, and we do not even believe now, that it was necessary to amend the formula as a consequence to what the Constitutional Court had ruled to allow independents to participate in the election. From a formula of 66 and 2/3 and 1/3 being proportional and equitable, respectively, the ANC, with their majority, changed that from 90% to 10%, so that they could grab more of the money. And in this instance, if this bill is not challenged, they would get 21 million rand more, which they're taking away from smaller parties. So indeed, it is a grab, and it was not necessary for the formula that we had agreed to in terms of political party funding to have been amended to accommodate independence. It was just a ruse, because even Section 236 of the Constitution provides for funding to political parties, and it doesn't speak about amendments, so about independence. So we should have started with amending the Constitution to include independence before we even thought of amending this formula. Yeah. And I'll tell you what we're going to do as we move forward.
Okay, all right. So I wanted to get that in so that the viewer can get a clearer understanding of what is at play here. Lawson Naidoo, let's bring you into the conversation. Narend Singh talks about this bill, if left unchallenged. The president has signed it into law. Is there still an opportunity to challenge it or to have it amended?
Good evening, colleagues. Look, I think there's, the bill has now been signed by the president today. It will need to be formally proclaimed in the Gazette before it comes into effect. We still don't know whether all of the provisions of the Electoral Matters Amendment Bill will be proclaimed to come into effect on the same date and immediately. But having said that, I think we really need to go back to what was the purpose of this Electoral Matters Amendment Bill that went through Parliament in a very rushed way. It was there to amend a legislation that was necessary in order to accommodate independent candidates in these upcoming national and provincial elections. Many civil society organizations have argued right from the outset in Parliament that the amendments to the Political Party Funding Act were not consequential upon the inclusion of independence in the electoral process. There was no need to tamper with those provisions. It seems that the majority party took the opportunity to really, drive a horse and trailer through the Political Party Funding Act, which provided for the very first time in 2018 for a framework for transparency and somewhat regulation of the private funding of political parties. When this Amendment Act now comes into force, as Adrian Roos said, there will be no threshold. And in the 3 weeks or 2 weeks that are left before the elections, we can expect that significant amounts of money will flow to various political parties without any need for those parties to disclose the source of those funds. There's no ceiling on how much they can receive from a single donor. And this all flies in the face of previous constitutional court judgments that have said that the voters' right to know who funds political parties is an important component of the right to vote that is set out in the Constitution. Yeah. So this piece of legislation undermines that right to vote.
Mr. Roos, let's bring you back into the conversation. I think Lawson Naidoo really puts it plainly. The ANC, that's who the majority party is. It's the ANC. By the way, we did attempt to have them as part of this panel, but those attempts were not successful. You started the conversation by describing it as a money grab. Lawson Naidoo says there was no need to actually amend anything here. If anything, the only amendment was to accommodate independence. Now that the ANC has taken full advantage of this, there is a view from smaller parties that this is going to benefit those larger parties. Are you one of those larger parties that clearly will benefit? And if so, what are you complaining about?
Yeah, so I think, and what we've said, even with the multi-party charter, is that we need a new government in South Africa that is based on values. And one of the key values of the DA is fairness. And we have always opposed to this, even though the DA is the only other party that would actually get a slightly higher increase. I think we need to talk about the scale of this. It's probably, to some analyst estimates, more like 50 million windfall for the ANC just in this first year, and the DA would get about 7, I think. But if you talk about an act that is supposed to now include independent candidates, then any independent candidate's share would be less than halved. And I think we need to look at 2017, when we looked at the Political Party Funding Act and the ANC submission to that. And they said that funding should be divided between parties proportionally. However, additional resources should be allocated to the smallest parties to support diversity and prevent the system favoring incumbents. And I think it's clear that, at that stage, they never thought they'd be in the position they are now, where for the first time in our history, they're going to fall below 50%. And suddenly they're scrambling for additional funding. They cannot pay for posters. They take 5 years to pay service providers. And so suddenly they need to allocate this extra amount of money to themselves at the cost of political diversity. And this is something that the DA cannot stand for. We're a values-based organization, and that is why we rejected it out of hand.
Yeah. Mr. Narend Singh, let's come to you, because there's an element here that talks about this now also allowing for alterations in the criteria by political parties in declaring these donations. Do you want to explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, firstly, Claudia, I think Lawson made an important point about the operational date of the different sections of this legislation.
Right.
And we'll only know that, when the Gazette is published. Hopefully, we expect the operational date for the implementation of the formula to be postponed to a date in the 7th Parliament. But let's wait and see. And if that happens, then we'll drop our immediate challenge and look at it in the 7th Parliament. But insofar as the issue of the upper limits are concerned, for my colleague from the DA and for Lawson, last week, the Parliamentary Secretariat proposed a resolution that Parliament needed to pass where they were wanting us to agree to the 15 million rand per annum and the 100,000. So they want to bring back those clauses into this legislation as resolutions of Parliament. But we objected to that resolution being put to Parliament. In fact, it was due to be put on the 9th, because we argued, some of us, and let me say I represent 10 political parties here, and all 10 of us have sent a petition to the president, and it is very unfortunate that we have to read in the media what the president has done with the bill, signed it into an act, and we have not received any official correspondence reacting to our petition. So we said, you're putting the cart before the horse, because we don't have an act. At that time, it was still a bill. Well, I suppose after today and after the gazetting, they will still bring the resolution to the House where they want to have the cap of 15 million and 100,000 as it was in the Political Party Funding Act.
Yeah, well, I suppose it's no surprise why it would seem that the president has acted, and I would hate to use the word, but in a sneaky fashion. Lawson, Naidoo, let's bring you back in. Is that not worrying that part of this has to do with altering the criteria for political parties to make these declarations? Because that is one of the key elements of this, for the public to know who is donating to a particular political party, so that we know if, in a case of a tender, and that party tomorrow runs government, why then certain tenders would be channeled in a particular way? Wasn't that made in order to protect against things like that?
Indeed, that was the very purpose, one of the very purposes behind the Political Party Funding Act being passed by Parliament some 6 years ago. It was really an attempt it was an acknowledgement of the undue influence of money in politics. And as we heard from the testimony at the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, how state tenders were being allocated in a means with kickbacks to political parties, primarily the ruling party, the ANC. So now when we face a situation where there's no regulatory framework in place, it undermines the very intent of the Political Party Funding Act. It deprives voters of key information that we need in order to make decisions as to which political parties we're going to be voting for, because we need to know who funds those parties to make an assessment of the behavior of those political parties. And it's really shocking that the president has chosen to sign this piece of legislation into law without referring those offending sections of the bill relating to party funding back to Parliament to fix. And I think, the fact that, as Narend said, there was this proposal just a few days ago for Parliament to pass a resolution now, really to put back what the Act has now taken out of the Political Party Funding Act. It shows how short-sighted and how unrushed this piece of legislation was. It clearly wasn't thought through, and we're now left in a really difficult situation. So I suppose the only hope for now is that the president does not promulgate those particular sections dealing with the thresholds and the ceiling, and leave the current situation in place. And the one further point I want to make on this is when the Political Party Funding Act was passed some years ago, there was extensive public consultation around it and lots of debate in Parliament about the various aspects of this piece of legislation. When this Electoral Matters Amendment Bill was processed in Parliament, it was done in a rush. There was very little public participation. There was no public consultation process in the NCOP at all. And on those grounds, the legislation is certainly, constitutionally open to challenge.
Yeah. Mr. Roos, is there hope, as Lawson Naidoo puts it, that the promulgation now element of this could potentially be paused so that the cures can be done to this, what is clearly a rushed job for opportunistic purposes in order to benefit parties such as the ANC? And perhaps I'd like for you to also weigh in on the element that talks about the president having the power to determine limits, even though this is going to be with the guidance of the National Assembly. Talk to us about those two elements.
Yeah, so fortunately, the ability of the president to change these regulations unilaterally was reversed in the committee. And I think, unfortunately, the situation we talk about with the proposal from the ANC in Parliament, it's another case of the ANC coming to rescue a situation that they caused themselves. So even in the committee, it was clearly raised by parliamentary legal that there was going to be a problem created in the wording of the legislation, and that this situation would happen. And it was raised, and we agreed that this is problematic. And yet the ANC just went ahead. And I think the minister himself, he admitted that he didn't have the legal services. And you'll see a number of bills from the Department of Home Affairs that just haven't come to the fore. Critical legislation. And it's a plain result of cadre deployment. I mean, you have legal advisors that are supposed to draft legislation that is just incapable of doing it. And so we kept having a situation in the committee where we were told that the bill is imminent, and then it doesn't come. And then you have these shocking drafting anomalies, and you have a situation where regulations are taken out, which creates a mess in terms of legislation. And the ANC is advised on it, and they just push it through. And so, I think apart from the fact that, yes, it can be remedied and the president can decide to promulgate certain elements sooner rather than later, I think there's a number of underlying issues here that make it absolutely critical that we don't end up in this situation again. And one of the DA's key manifesto pillars is really re-establishing Parliament and the credibility of Parliament, which is being damaged by situations like this, where you have bad law that is passed, that is forced through against advice, and then later on there's some haphazard attempt to remedy the situation. We shouldn't be in this situation. The IEC shouldn't be in this situation. And this is legislation that was supposed to facilitate independent candidates participating in elections. And now you have a situation where they are actually they're having their potential cut of the political party funding more than halved. And so we absolutely need a change in this government. I think it's the burning question, really, at the end of the day.
Mr. Singh,
Yes, sir.
Last few comments now. You already have some political parties that have said to their supporters, give us money, but just make sure that it's below 100,000 so that we don't have to declare to anyone. So you have parties that say things like that. But for a president to act in this fashion, well, you can only hope that you have a parliament that is going to be strong enough to reverse some of this. Mr. Roos talks about the credibility of Parliament possibly coming into question here. Do you think that the 7th Parliament has the power to actually reverse this?
Yes, definitely so. But we would like to see some kind of reversal, and we would like to see the court, particularly the Constitutional Court, make a judgment on what they believe to be proportional and equitable. And lo and behold, you may find that they may say it's 50-50. and then the ANC will lose out completely. But I think as the 10 political parties, we met this afternoon virtually, and we will be considering taking legal advice on how we should proceed in approaching the courts, whether we interdict the IEC from making these allocations at all. Because remember also that this was a second supplementary budget for the 2023-2024 financial year.
Yeah.
So the formula that was applicable then should apply. That's probably one of our legal arguments. But we're hoping that people like Lawson, Naidoo, and CASAC and the other NGOs who do get funding and do have not only financial but human resources will take this matter to court so we can become amicus curiae. Because, Lawson, we don't have a lot of money, and now they're taking away money from us. So we hope you can do that, and we can talk about this tomorrow and see how we get this through our justice system.
Okay, I'm going to reserve that question for Lawson Naidoo. But before we go to Lawson, you said you represent several parties, Mr. Singh. Just out of interest, I'm curious here, is the EFF part of those?
Surprisingly, no. And even when the members spoke on this bill, I was sitting there listening, and I felt that she didn't have a grasp of what was happening. And I contacted one of the senior leaders of the party at the very moment and said, I think you're going off. He said, no, we're not going to lose money. Well, I don't know where he gets that from, because they are also going to lose money. Like you said earlier on, the only two parties that are going to benefit from this new formula is the ANC and the DA. And the DA have expressed themselves that it's a matter of principle that they've come together with us, the other 9 parties, to take this matter up and follow all the procedures. We went to the president. We were allowed to do so in terms of the Constitution. We sent a petition. We haven't received a response to the petition, and now we see this. So I think we followed all the steps. But again, my appeal to the NGOs, you started, and we'll join you.
All right, Lawson Naidoo, you get to have the last word. Do you have the appetite to take this to court on behalf of Mr. Singh and others?
Thanks. Look, let me start first with the important point that Narend just made.
Yeah.
This additional allocation of 200 million in this appropriation budget came from last year's financial resources, last year's financial year. So he's absolutely correct that it will have to be dispersed by the IEC on the basis of the formula that existed at that time, which was the 2/3 proportional, 1/3 equitable split, which had been agreed in the Party Funding Act. And second point there is that the funds will only be dispersed to represented political parties, the parties that already have seats either in the National Assembly or in provincial legislatures. So new political parties that are contesting this election for the first time, independent candidates, will not benefit from this allocation of those additional public funds that have been earmarked. On the issue of the formula, I'm not convinced that the 90-10 formula is necessarily unconstitutional. It was the formula that was in place for almost 20 years. Nobody challenged it during that time. And I think if one is going to go to court simply on the basis of the formula, I'm not convinced that the Constitutional Court or any other court is going to rule that that is unconstitutional. It certainly does not assist in the process of strengthening multi-party democracy. It's unfair to smaller political parties and independent representatives in the future. But I think one must be wary about challenging this. And I think hopefully the 7th Parliament will be able to apply a more equitable mind to this issue and come up with a fairer and a more effective way of dispersing public funds, as well as funds that are donated to the Multi-Party Democracy Fund in a manner that truly enhances multi-party democracy.
Yeah. All right. Lawson Naidoo, I did say that you were the last speaker. Mr. Roos, any final thoughts before I close it?
Yeah, look, I think the final thought, as I said, looking at what is going on in this Amendment Act, you're having a constitutional imperative to proportionality and encouraging a multi-party democracy undermined. You're having funding redirected to the largest political party for their own use. And I think, people need to look at this and see that an act that was supposed to be purely about including independent candidates and allowing them to contest elections to be twisted this way. You can just imagine how every piece of legislation, the same thing is happening. So we need to stand up and rescue South Africa and vote on the 29th of May for change.
Well, I think that's my fault because that's campaigning now. All right, gentlemen, to all of you, thank you very much for your time. That is Adrian Roos from the Democratic Alliance, Narend Singh from the IFP, and the gentleman from the Council for the Advancement of the South African Council is Lawson Naidoo. Lawson Naidoo. Thank you so much to all of you. I think that is very clear as to what has happened here. Yeah, and I wonder what you make of the president's actions here.